Thank you, Matthias. Again, I'm Radhika. For those of you joined late, I'm from the tech world of Silicon Valley and the Stanford community and one of the co-conveners here. And again, welcome. Exciting to have people from all over the world joining us today. And also excited to be moderating this panel on the topic of AI, ML, data science. We'll be touching on bias as well and how all of these impact the SDGs. We will be hearing perspectives from two of the leading academics on opportunities and challenges in this moment of rapid digital transformation. A moment of reimagining ourselves and our world. We will hear on how inclusive innovation and technology is helping us leapfrog, how it can tackle the great challenges of our times. As we race into the digital transformation, one question on people's minds is, can AI help alleviate human biases or will it scale them more rapidly? We'll again hear from our speakers on this as well. But before I invite our speakers, I want to share some overall context on implicit bias and the findings of a study at Stanford on bias. Bias, I believe, is a key challenge we need to tackle if we are to achieve the SDGs. We all have biases. In fact, it's been shown that it's an evolutionary feature that helps our mind rapidly categorize. I was part of a recent Stanford Spark and Ullman study where we examined the nature of bias in the investment industry with academic rigor. The results shocked the industry. They challenged the thinking that the tiny number of women and African Americans in the investment industry is just a pipeline problem, that not enough qualified candidates. In fact, we found that the more qualified an African American fund manager, the greater the biases against them. I'm sharing on the chat a link to this study. Now, this one was not focused on technology, but I just wanted to share some context on how prevalent biases are in our world, including in the top echelons of power. And now, without further ado, I'm honored to welcome and introduce two friends and colleagues, two of my favorite academics from my own alma mater, Stanford and UC Berkeley. First, Professor Jeff Ullman of Stanford. Jeff needs no introduction to those from the tech field. He's a brilliant computer scientist and academic. His textbooks are regarded as standards in their fields around the world. Some of his students have gone on to start companies such as Google that have transformed our lives. Earlier, he was at Bell Labs and a faculty at Princeton University, chair of the CS department. He was elected to the National Academy of Engineering, National Academy of Arts and Sciences. The side you may not know of Jeff that I love the most is that he cares very deeply about helping society and impact and willing to help on the role of tech in tackling the societal challenges of our times. We'll hear some of that as well. The other professor is another amazing, brilliant professor, UC Berkeley professor Josh Blumenstock, a very mission-driven academic at the School of Information at UC Berkeley. Josh is a director of the Data Intensive Development Lab. He is co-director at the Center for Effective Global Action at UC Berkeley, CIGA, housed at UC Berkeley, which brings together brilliant mission-driven academics from across disciplines from US West Coast schools to work on the challenges of our times in partnership with governments and NGOs around the world, bringing academic rigor to effectively measure impact of interventions as well as collaborate on solutions. I myself am honored to be on the board of SIGA and a huge fan of Josh's. Josh has been involved in projects and research in remote parts of the world that bring the power of tech and data to help society. Welcome, Jeff, Josh. We will get started with Jeff. Jeff, over to you.
Okay, hi. Okay, I have a couple of slides I would like to show you. Well, let me just try to get things going. Let's see. Here's my. Why is it I cannot find?
You are sharing.
Yeah, I'm sharing, but no, this is not useful. Okay, let me get the slides up.
There they are. We see them, Jeff.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Come on. Okay. So I don't know. I want to play the I won't say devil's advocate, but I want to express a little bit of the concerns I have that the world changes, and especially to the technology world changes, and when we aren't changing with it. So I want to talk very briefly about really three things. One is a notion of privacy, which I think needs to change more than people are willing to do. The second is sort of people are blaming AI, machine learning, for faults that are not really the fault of the technology. And the last thing I want to talk about is ownership of data, another idea which I think we're not addressing quite properly. Okay. Well, this is my slogan. I don't care if my toaster sees me naked. It's a machine. Okay. I don't, there may be things that I don't want you to know about me, but if if Google computers have information about me, it's not really as important as people having a knowledge of what I do or think. Okay, a colleague of mine, Gio Wiederhold, has pointed out for many years that the privacy as we understand it is a relatively modern construct. That is, 200 years ago, you lived in a little village, everybody knew who you were doing, what you were doing. It wasn't until the rise of large cities where people felt that they had this right to an anonymity. Now, in a sense, we're living in a global village. Okay, everybody's online. Everybody has the same right to know, or the same ability to know about what everybody is up to, that they had about the smaller number of people in a village 200 years ago. And in particular, the thing that disturbs me is that this notion of a right to be forgotten. I think it's a really bad idea. There are things that we really have a right to know. If I'm going to loan you money, I'd like to know whether you have a record of paying it back or not. I just might point out there's something called Megan's Law in the United States, which actually requires that municipalities make available online information about, are there sex offenders living next door to me? Okay, I think that is a right that transcends any hypothetical right to privacy. Okay. Now, the second area I want to talk about a little bit is what I think is a mistaken placement of blame on AI. Okay, now first of all, by AI, really machine learning these days, is you create a model of something, and that model is based on data. Okay, and you then use the model to drive decision making. Now, the fact is that there are opportunities for bias, as long as the data, if the data has biases built into it, then the model that you build is going to share those biases. The canonical example is, let's say a company might decide they want to automate the resume processing process, where a program will look at your resume and decide whether it's worth interviewing you. And they might take the data about the people that their own employees, and they know which of their employees have been successful and which have not. If they use that data then to build the model of what a resume of a good candidate looks like. Okay, now if the company has in fact been, let's say, undervaluing minorities, undervaluing women, whatever, then the data is going to carry some biases, and a perfectly good machine learning algorithm will produce a model that shares those biases. We can't avoid that, except of course by telling them not to use that data. So sometimes you hear this idea that machine learning is somehow it introduces evil. I really don't think that that's true, and simply it's because people confuse bad data with bad algorithms. Okay, if your data is shows a bias or is any other way bad, the model that machine learning builds is going to be bad. I want to talk a very specific example of a system called Word2Vec that was developed at Google. And it's sort of an amazing thing, but people have actually written papers about how terrible Word2Vec is, as if it were somehow evil. So the idea is you use as data sort of a large corpus, say Wikipedia, okay, and you use it to assign a vector to each word. And it's a high dimensional vector. It's a couple of hundred dimensions typically. So it's a long vector. And in one of several different ways now, you can arrange that words, the vectors point in more or less the same direction if the words that appear around those words are similar. So for example, you might expect that the vectors for Pepsi and for Coke would point in more or less the same direction, because people are going to talk about them in the same way. The word drink, for example, will appear very commonly near Pepsi and also near Coke. Okay. Now, one of the interesting things is you can do vector arithmetic. You can add vectors or subtract vectors. And so people noticed, for example, that if you take the vector for the word king and you throw away the vector for the word man and add in the vector for the word woman, you get something very, very interesting. Again, what you're doing is you're taking the words around king and throwing away things that also appear around man, like the word he, for example, or his, him. And then you're throwing in the corresponding words around women, she, her, hers. What you get is something very close to the vector for queen. Okay, and when you think about it, that makes sense. Okay, now people get kind of upset when they see vectors like this. Okay, you do the same thing, starting with the vector for doctor, and you sort of switch, change it from man to woman, and you get nurse, and this. Again, there are papers about this, how terrible it is that Word2Vec does this. Well, I don't think it's the fault of the algorithm. Okay, the algorithm is faithful. It does what it does distinguish meanings of words. If you build it, I'm assuming you're building it from a corpus like Wikipedia. Wikipedia, I believe, is unbiased in the sense that it reflects the thoughts of I don't know, hundreds of thousands of different people. And certainly the algorithm that you use to construct these vectors is not itself biased, okay? What people are really fussed about, maybe rightfully so, is that the world is biased in the sense that nurse is a profession that is like the profession doctor, but has more women. And that's exactly what this equation that we're talking about, doctor minus man plus woman equals nurse. That's exactly what it's asking, and that's exactly what it tells you. Okay, so the whole point I wanted to make there is we should be careful about blaming technology when what we're really upset with is either the data, which comes from a biased source, or just the world isn't the way we want it to be. Okay. It is entirely possible that 20 years from now, doctors and nurses will be equally likely to be men or women, and then this equation would not really hold. Okay. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about was ownership of data. Okay. There is a viewpoint that says when you type data into a website, the data that you type belongs to you. Okay. And in particular, one of the most remarkable things is that people are trying to tax companies like Google or Facebook for basically obtaining data from the people who use the system. Okay. Now, obviously, there are some cases where the data really it really has to belong to you, like your credit card number is not something that should ever be public. However, I think what people are forgetting is that use of a website is a two-party transaction. So just as a simple, maybe crazy example is, if I loan you my car, I believe I own the fact that I loaned you the car. I can remember it. I can use that fact as I will. Now you have all the same right to say that the fact that you borrowed the car from me is a fact that you own, and you presumably have the right, to tell people that Ullman's willing to loan his car out if you need it. Now, when you think about it online, let's talk about, I type a search query into to Google. Many people think, therefore, that I own the fact that I made that search query. On the other hand, Google put this search box up for me to use. Nobody forced me to use it, and it's their business. They have as much right, I believe, to say that they own the fact that I used, that I entered something into their search box. Okay, and as the last thought is, somehow the world seems to be coming down on one side of what seems to be a rather symmetric transaction. Okay, I don't have to use Google. Google doesn't have to let me use their search box if they don't want to. We have this sort of even-handed transaction, and each of us, I believe, has as much right as the other to know what has happened. Okay, so with that, I will shut up and stop sharing. Okay, there we go.
Thank you, Jeff, for that very thought-provoking and objective kind of lens, bringing that on, like data technology versus the technology that's reflecting the human world as it is, whether we like it or not. And I always, it's easy to get kind of our ideology carried away. I myself, I feel very strongly about we need to tackle biases. And I find it very refreshing to kind of face the fact that technology is not this super intelligent, more intelligent than the human creature that is evil and manipulating us, but it's reflecting the world. And thank you for bringing those perspectives, Jeff. I see that your talk has generated a lot of dialogue on chat. Thank you, which I was expecting. I love that there's never a dull moment when Jeff presents. And we may, if we have time, we will invite the speakers to comment, but I know we're in a tight schedule, so if we run out, we will follow up later. Next, I'd like to invite Josh to share perspectives. I also shared a link to SIGA if for whoever's interested.
Thank you. Radhika, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, I can, and we can hear you clearly as well, Josh.
Great.
Welcome.
Well, thank you, Radhika, and to the other organizers for inviting me, and Jeff for that talk. I was going to preface this talk by saying that I thought this might be a little bit provocative and polemic, but I'm glad to follow on your footsteps because I think you may have set the tone well. So what I wanted to do is spend the next 10 minutes, rather than giving like a high-level overview, doing a little bit more of a deep dive into one specific project that I think can help illustrate some of the tension between both the promises and pitfalls of how AI and big data and new data sources can be used for one purpose that I think has like a very positive pro-social motivation, but I think it also highlights the tensions involved in data privacy and ethics and so forth. So just to provide one slide of context, because I realize not everyone works in the world that I work in, which is just to highlight the scale of the coronavirus in low and middle income countries. So you can see this article is a little bit old, but the situation hasn't actually changed. If anything, it's gotten worse. Highlights that over 250 million people in developing countries are likely to be facing acute hunger by the end of 2020. And so what's going on is that the lockdown orders that are designed to keep people in place are also preventing them from working. And when you take a large population that's either below the poverty line or just above it, and you remove their primary means of subsistence, this creates massive food insecurity. And so in response to this, spiraling crisis, governments around the world are mobilizing humanitarian aid. They're trying to get food and cash to people that would otherwise go hungry. And they're faced with this really critical challenge, which is how do they identify the people in their population with the greatest need for this humanitarian support? And the reason this is a critical problem is that many countries, especially low and middle income countries, lack reliable data on who is eating well and who is not. And in particular in low and middle income countries, income data, like what you would get from tax returns, is notoriously incomplete and unreliable. A lot of people are not earning wage income, they're consuming home-produced food and so forth. And, I mean, we could talk about whether income data that the IRS collects in the US was the right way to target subsidies in response to the US's coronavirus crisis. But just imagine the situation is an order of magnitude more complicated in developing countries. And of course, they can't just go out and collect data in the middle of a pandemic when they're trying to minimize face-to-face contact. So, how do we think about targeting humanitarian aid in the middle of a pandemic? And the problem is, as I mentioned, that existing status quo data sources like census data or poverty scorecard data are often out of date and don't capture the people that are recently poor due to sort of a change in circumstances. So what I'm going to focus on for the next 7 or 8 minutes is how new data sources can help fill these gaps. And I'll talk about some work that we're doing in Togo, in Uganda, and we'll see about time during Q&A, other countries that use satellite data and data from mobile phone companies to try and provide one solution to this targeting challenge. And in the process, you'll hopefully see like both why this is useful, like why it's maybe useful to take these private data, these non-traditional data, and use them to fill this gap, but also why it raises privacy and ethical challenges that need to be addressed. And I should mention, like, why am I going to focus on satellite data and phone data as opposed to like Android data or whatever? It's because satellites and feature phones are the 2 digital devices that are close to ubiquitous in developing countries. So in the satellite-based approach, the idea is we take high-resolution satellite imagery. So this is showing a map of Nigeria, and we use machine learning algorithms to identify sort of hallmark signals of wealth and poverty in these satellite images. Now, I'm not going to talk about the details, but the intuition is that in some images, you can see that houses have higher quality roofs, or higher quality roads, or different size plots of land, or different building density. And machine learning algorithms are, at their core, advanced technologies for pattern detection, pattern recognition. And so machine learning algorithms can recognize these patterns and use them to create really granular maps like this that sort of highlight the poorest and wealthiest regions of the country. And now, why is this useful? The key point is that this is the sort of data that a government would collect. So in 2019, the government of Nigeria ran the 50,000 household survey. And this is showing the approximate locations of the 50,000 households that were surveyed. Now, the typical thing a National Statistical Office would do is to take these estimates and produce something like state or county level estimates of the poverty rate in each region. Now, why would we care about satellite imagery? Well, the point is, instead of having to rely on these relatively low resolution estimates of the distribution of wealth and poverty, we can think about using maps like this in order to guide policy interventions. And so this is exactly what the government of Togo is doing right now, which is they're relying on actually poverty estimates that my lab has constructed based on high resolution satellite imagery and other data, and use that to determine which cantons, you can think of a canton as a village in the Togolese context, are the poorest, and they're prioritizing those cantons for the distribution of humanitarian aid. So if you're interested, I can show you lots of analysis that shows that using these satellite-based maps gets them much better at actually targeting the true poor. In other words, both precision and recall are higher than if they were using existing census data. So that's like what I've called the satellite-based approach. Let me turn towards where I think it gets even more controversial, where we talk about how personal data can be used to even better improve the targeting of humanitarian aid. So satellites are one piece of the puzzle. They can tell you, for instance, which villages are the poorest. But then you still have this problem of having to identify who are the people in those villages. Now, this may strike you as like a non-issue in a place like the US, but in a place like Togo, the government doesn't know. So they identify a village. They don't know who lives in that village because they don't have an up-to-date government registry that tracks the entire population. So yes, under normal circumstances, you can imagine them going to each village with food aid or cash aid and handing it out to people that live there. But in the middle of a pandemic, when you don't want face-to-face contact and they want to do remote transfers, this is a very non-trivial problem. And so to give it a concrete example of how this works is I'll highlight work being done in Uganda, where it's basically, I think, 4 or 5 steps. First, specific villages are prioritized for assistance using satellite imagery, using external data. Second, and this is the key difference, the government works with the phone companies. So the phone companies, because when people use their cell phones, and they don't have to have GPS enabled or data packages or anything, just based on the cell phone towers that people are using when they make and receive phone calls, the cell phone company has a pretty good idea of who lives in those targeted villages. So then the phone company sends a text message to all of the people that they've identified as likely living in those villages and directs them to a USSD platform. In other words, like a simple menu interface where they type in a short code on their phone, they hit pound, enter, and then they're taken to an interface. And on the interface, there's a series of questions that ask the person, the phone user, about themselves, as well as information to sort of, offers them the opportunity to opt into the program, and critically to share their data with the NGO Give Directly that is distributing the aid. So if the subscriber consents to sharing, then Give Directly processes the data. If the person qualifies, then the government transfers the money directly to the individual's mobile phone. Like there's a mobile money account based on the phone that's used to receive the transfer. So, again, why is the phone company involved in this government social protection program? Why is Give Directly involved? Well, the key point is that the government doesn't have a better way to identify who lives in the villages that they want to prioritize. And so in many developing countries, this is the case, that the databases maintained by the mobile phone operators are the most up-to-date location registries of anything in the country, including official government ones. So let me talk about one more example, which I think just like increases the level of complexity and potential concerns, which is that another reason why phone data can be useful in the targeting of humanitarian aid is that the metadata that people generate when they use their phone has been shown to be very predictive of a person's socioeconomic status. I've published papers on this. We can talk about the details, but the idea is that wealthy people use their phones differently than poor people. They make more international calls. They spend more money every month. They use data plans in ways that are distinct from poor people. And so there is the potential to use machine learning technology to distinguish, even within a location, the people that are relatively wealthy from the people that are relatively poor. So this raises two key questions. First of all, does this work, right? Like, can we use mobile phone metadata to identify eligible program beneficiaries? And the answer is fairly conclusively yes, and I won't demonstrate this to you now, but I've worked on this problem for maybe 10 years and have several studies that demonstrate this. But the key point is that the two things you care about in administering humanitarian aid are errors of exclusion, in other words, not giving money to people that actually need it, and errors of inclusion, in other words, giving money to people that don't actually need it. And we can show fairly rigorously that when you use mobile phone data, you can reduce both errors of exclusion and inclusion relative to an approach that doesn't rely on phone data. Now, let me sort of skip the details here. We can come back to them if people are interested in the Q&A. Now, the second question that I'm sure a lot of you are wondering about, and I see the chat window there's text in it, but I'm not reading it because I'm talking, is it worth it, right? Now, the key trade-off here is that on the one hand, of course, we want to enable effective humanitarian response, right? We want cash aid from the government to go to the people that need it most, right? That's the reason we might want to use these technologies. Now, on the other hand, we also don't want to enable misuse, privacy infringements, potential future misappropriation. So there are many practical, social, and ethical considerations, and I think a starting point is that human rights doctrine emphasizes that any sort of infringements like this must be necessary and proportionate. And so just to list some of the ones that I think some of you are already wondering about are concerns about data access and data privacy. Who has access to what data? How long does that access persist? Of course, we need to think about the governing legal and regulatory frameworks, which differ from country to country. I haven't said this yet, but hopefully I can't emphasize enough that I'm not advocating that phone-based targeting of aid should replace existing social protections, but it can be another layer. In particular, another layer that can help catch people that would fall through the cracks of existing registries, which, as we've established, are fairly out of date. Of course, there's issues of how do you get aid to people who don't have phones, and many more, including some of the biases that were discussed in previous by previous speakers. So, and sorry, this is a paper I wrote a couple of years ago, or about a year ago, 2 years ago, confused about dates, that talks to at least my perspective on some of these issues in a little bit more detail. Just to summarize in one slide, I think two key points, right? The first is this, that new data sources, when combined with machine learning technology, offer clear promise for improving the targeting of humanitarian aid. But, and the second point is there are many potential pitfalls, ethical, practical, political, and social. And I think I just want to make sure that, like, my take on this is that there's a tendency to render sweeping judgments about whether one data should be used in general or not. But I think the key thing to emphasize, in particular in the middle of a humanitarian crisis, is that every context is unique, right? Different countries have different needs for this sort of technology. They have different status quo solutions. And there's also different regulatory concerns and privacy concerns. So I think to really talk about, the two key questions, does this work and is it worth it, really requires doing a deep dive into the country that is in question, rather than sort of saying, oh no, let's like never use data for this purpose, or let's always use data because it can have this pro-social impact. So with that, let me stop. Hopefully there's some time for questions. My contact info is up here. I'll leave it for another 10 seconds and then stop sharing slides, but I'll hand it back to you, Radhika. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, for another very thought-provoking presentation. And again, kind of bringing forth the point that the data privacy and these issues are way more nuanced. There is no black and white solution or a clear-cut answer. It is this, both of your presentations are really going to inform a lot of the discussions and workshops tomorrow. Josh, would you mind sharing the link to your paper on the chat? Both of your talks have generated quite a bit of dialogue. I have been informed by the MC that unfortunately we don't have time for Q&A. I as a moderator chose to give you both more speaking time, knowing how amazing presenters you are. So we will have to go to the next session. But for those of you who've been posing the questions, we'll follow up. The one question I'll leave with both of you, Jeff and Josh, that has been on the chat very active is people agree that, most people agree that technology reflects the world. It's not right to blame the technology. The data could be biased. The raging question there is the imbalance of power between the consumer and the corporate. And isn't there something that needs to be done there? And I think that's something that could be a whole talk in itself. So I am going to hand over to Matthias, but I will leave this with you. And if you have thoughts on that to share, send it to me, Josh, Jeff, and we will share with the community because this is what they're asking, that isn't that power imbalance a major factor to think about on the privacy side. Over to you, Matthias, and sorry to do this, but we have so many amazing speakers from around the world. Each of us have committed to stay on track on our time. So back to you, Matthias.